The SteerSmart's YETI XD no-drill top-mount drag link with the Griffin XD attenuator and red bellow is for those of you that have a 2007 to 2018 JK that are looking for a new drag link that's going to be much stronger than the factory one and also have a lot of additional features built right in. This is going to be a 2 out of 3 wrenches for the installation, not because it's overly difficult, but because getting these factory tie rod ends out of their tapered fit joints can be a little bit difficult. Stay tuned for the installation. I'm going to walk you through it and show you exactly how to get it done. Now, when you're looking for drag links, there are going to be a couple of reasons that you might want to buy one. You might have already bent your factory one. You may have a little bit of a loose or wobbly feeling because yours is bending on the road, or maybe you just want to eliminate the possibility of bending yours by getting something that's much beefier. I'm going to show you this in comparison to the factory one in just a second. This is much, much bigger. So on top of being much larger, this also has a few additional features like I mentioned before. This attenuator is designed to dampen a lot of the shock that you would otherwise feel through the steering wheel when driving, and you're also going to get a drag link flip out of this drag link, where normally the drag link is mounted on the bottom side of the steering knuckle. Now it's on the top side, so that's going to help change up your steering geometry a little bit. It's going to help provide a little bit of additional clearance when you're off-road, but do keep in mind that you shouldn't change just the mounting point of your drag link without also changing the mounting point, at least one, of your track bar. You want the track bar and the drag link to remain parallel, or you're going to end up with bump steer. As you can see here, these bars are not parallel. We would have bump steer if we were driving down the road in this configuration. You would either need to raise this side of the track bar or drop this side down to get these back into parallel. So again, keep that in mind. It's very, very important. One other thing I want to talk about with this drag link is the price of it. Now, because this thing is so beefy, it is very well built, it has the attenuator, which is not something that any of the other brands out there are going to have. This is certainly going to be more expensive than almost any other drag link out there that you can buy, coming in at right around that $670 mark. Now, is it worth it? If you like the idea of this attenuator, if you really want something that's big and beefy like this, yeah, I do think it's worth it. SteerSmart makes a really high quality piece. So if you have the budget, if this has the features you're looking for, I do think it's going to be a pretty good buy. But like I mentioned before, we're going to go 2 out of 3 wrenches for this installation. Let me show you how to do it. For this installation, we used a 13/16 inch wrench, an 18mm and 10mm wrench as well. Also a few sockets, a 13/16, a 15mm, and a T40 Torx end socket. We also used a 19mm deep well to remove our tire, but that's not a completely necessary step. We drove all of those sockets with a combination of a 3/8 socket driver and a 1/2 inch pneumatic impact, and of course we also needed a big hammer. So as we mentioned before, this is going to be a 2 out of 3 wrenches for the installation. There isn't any cutting or any major modification of the Jeep to do, but this can be a little bit difficult to get accomplished, and I'm going to tell you why right now. Obviously, you are going to have to remove your drag link in order to get this new drag link installed. And the way that the drag link is attached to the Jeep is with tie rod ends on both ends, the pitman arm and the steering knuckle arm, and those tie rod ends are going to be taper fits. So as you drive that nut on there, it pulls those two pieces together and they make a really strong connection. However, when you're removing those nuts, because these are locking nuts and they're not castle nuts with cotter pins, the only way sometimes to get those nuts off without spinning the whole stud inside the tie rod end is with an impact. Now, over here, as you can see, we've taken the tire off. That gives you a little bit of a better view and lets us get tools in there a little bit better. We're able to get a big 1/2 inch impact on top of this nut, and we can buzz this off without spinning the stud, and that's not so much of a problem for us. But over here, if this nut is spinning the stud in here, the only way to get an impact on here is to first pull the larger nut that's on the pitman arm, use a pitman arm puller to get the pitman arm down to give you room to work. In order to get a pitman arm puller on there, you might also have to remove the track bar. You can see that this gets a lot more involved. Now, once you do have those nuts removed, or at least almost completely loosened, the way that you get those taper fits broken is not necessarily by hitting down on top of the nut. If you don't have these pieces pressed that well together, that might work just fine. But if you really have to start wailing on things, you can mushroom the top of your tie rod end, you can screw up the threads, you can really cause a whole lot of issues. The way to actually get these removed is to strike the side of, in this case, the steering arm, or up here, the pitman arm. Of course, you don't want to damage your steering box, but if you strike these on the side, actually perpendicular to the stud of the tie rod end, that's the way to get these popped down. So you really want to get that nut pretty much completely removed, spin it on just enough that this isn't going to fall to the ground when it does release, and hit the end of the steering knuckle or the pitman arm pretty hard to get those to pop apart. So that's pretty much the explanation for how to get everything removed. And again, that's why this is a 2 out of 3 wrenches, because there's a little bit to it. Now let me show you how to do it, then we'll get our new Draglink installed. So our first step is going to be our big impact, a 13/16 socket on the steering knuckle end of the Draglink here, and we're gonna remove this nut completely, then spin it on a couple of threads in order to pop the Draglink out of the steering knuckle. So there we go, we have the nut removed. Like I said, spin it back on, just a couple of threads. All that's really there to do is to catch this Draglink when it falls so it doesn't completely swing down and hit the floor. So like I said before, this is where you want to strike this in order to pop that tapered fit apart. We're going to be using this 24-ounce hammer here, but depending on how pressed everything is, how rusted everything is, you may need an even larger hammer to get this job done. As you can see, a couple of whacks and that taper fit comes apart. Everything's still held together by that nut that we threaded on a couple of threads here. So this side's completely taken care of. We'll move on to the pitman arm end. Now we've moved on to the pitman arm end of our Draglink. Now we've got really lucky here. We were able to spin this nut off without the stud spinning inside the tie rod with just a regular wrench. Again, if you aren't able to do this, if the stud is spinning, you're gonna have to get an impact on it of some kind, and that can require a little bit more removal of the steering system. So we ended up actually getting a ratcheting wrench on here, and we were able to spin our locking nut completely off without spinning the stud inside the tie rod end, which is always really nice. So at this point, I'm not going to be able to get our wrench back out of here, so we're just going to put a couple of quick turns on the end of our nut again to make sure that nothing's going to fall when we strike the pitman arm and drop the tie rod end out of it. And again, you don't want to hit on the pitman arm too hard because you can cause damage and leaking to the steering box. So some of you may feel more comfortable using a pulling tool here or even a pickling fork to get in between, but you certainly don't want to rip this rubber bushing on the tie rod end if you ever plan on reusing this Draglink. There we go, able to get that to drop down. Get our wrench out of there. Now we can spin the nut off the rest of the way and drop the Draglink out of the pitman. Now we can come back to the steering knuckle end of our Draglink, remove the nut, and get the Draglink completely out of the Jeep. As you can see, when you have your stock Draglink side by side with your new SteerSmarts Draglink, there are a ton of differences. So the biggest thing you're going to notice is just the size of these. This is going to be a much larger tie rod end when you compare it to the factory one. Of course, this is going to be the same over here. All of the tubing, all of the threading, everything is just a lot bigger. So that means your tie rod ends are going to hold up a lot better. They're not going to wear out as quickly, and you're going to have much less of a chance of your Draglink bending in maybe an off-road situation. In fact, I've even seen situations where this Draglink can have a little bit of flex in it on the road, which can make it feel like something's loose in your steering or almost like you have a wobble, but ultimately it's just your Draglink flexing. So you're certainly not going to have any of those issues with your new, much larger SteerSmarts Draglink. The other big thing that you're going to notice, and it's a little bit hard to tell on the table here, you'll be able to see it better when we get it in the vehicle, is that this is backwards, and that's because this is a flipped Draglink. So instead of the Draglink coming up from the bottom of the steering knuckle, it's going to come down from the top. And what's unique about this setup is it has this little taper piece right here. This does not require any drilling at all. In the past, and even with a lot of other brands out there now, in order to do a flip Draglink kit, you need a specific tapered drill bit, which can be very expensive and also very hard to find, and you need to drill out that steering knuckle in order to flip the taper and get this installed. So this is very different from this one, but with this setup that has this little sleeve here, no drilling required, makes the install nice and easy. But as you can see here, this is going to be an opposite bend because this is a flip Draglink. But let's talk about the biggest difference, and it's going to be right here. Your factory Draglink is just the tubing. Your Steer Smarts has this attenuator built into it, and essentially what it is another version of a steering dampener. You can think of it like that. And what it's designed to do is suck up a lot of that jolt that you might get when you're driving down the highway, you're driving off-road at speed, and any sort of harsh input comes in from this end, from the steering end. It's going to get sucked up in the attenuator before it ever gets to the pitman arm, which would then translate it to your arms, your hands, while you're driving. So it's going to give a much smoother feel when you're driving, especially over those rough roads or those rougher trails. So the similarities here are that they are both Draglinks, but the differences definitely outweigh the similarities. This is going to be a much beefier piece that has a lot more features than that factory Draglink. So here we have your new Draglink. The way that you get this assembled, because it does come out of the box in 3 pieces, is to thread this end just about 3 threads into the attenuator. On the other end, the same thing, just about 3 threads. Then hold both tie rod ends while you spin the attenuator. And the idea there is that as it closes in, you're going to have the same amount of threads on both ends here. That way, when you're adjusting, things aren't going to be out of whack. You do want to leave these clamps completely loose because we are going to go ahead and adjust that in order to recenter the steering wheel. So we'll take care of that in just a second. Now, normally with the tie rod end, the way that you need to get it installed is to apply pressure for the tie rod end, that taper end of the tie rod end, to lock into the steering knuckle and the pitman arm, and then drive these nuts on pretty hard, usually with an impact. Now the benefit to something like this is it has a way that you can hold those studs on either side. So on this end, we're just going to use a large adjustable wrench, or we'll find the actual size wrench that we need here to hold on to that. And on this end, you're going to need a Torx bit on the inside of that tie rod end in order to keep that stud from spinning. So that's a big benefit, because on the bottom of these, you have these really nice polished caps, you have your grease fittings. So in order to get a pry bar in there and put enough pressure on this thing to keep that stud from spinning while you tighten the nut, that's going to be a tall order. So with all of that being said, it's finally time to get this thing installed in the Jeep. So we're going to remove the nuts off the top of these. We'll probably start up here at the pitman arm, getting it hung from the Jeep, and then we'll get our steering end installed on the steering knuckle. All right, so we'll spin the nut off the pitman arm side of our Draglink here. Get that tie rod end set up inside the pitman arm, and start our nut back on the top to hold everything together. All right, now we can move over to the steering arm side. On this end, we're going to do the same thing, remove the nut, but we're also going to remove this taper piece. Set our tie rod end in the top of the steering knuckle. And then before we put our nut on, we're going to set that tapered piece right up inside from the bottom. And that's really what does all the magic here. That's what keeps us from having to drill out the steering knuckle in order to get this Draglink flipped. As you can see, Draglink on top instead of on the bottom like it is from the factory. While we're on this end, we're going to get things tightened down. So we have a 13/16 ratcheting wrench for the nut, and then we have a 10mm ratcheting wrench that's going to hold the stud in place. And we'll go ahead and get this tightened down. Now this does need to be torqued to 105 foot-pounds, so make sure after you get this tight enough that your stud isn't going to spin inside the steering knuckle, that you get your torque wrench on here and get this torqued down properly. Now we can tighten down this side. We have the same 13/16 ratcheting wrench here, but instead of holding the center stud with a 10mm, we have a T40 Torx. Now we have a Torx bit in a wrench here, so it's going to be a little bit tight to fit. We're not going to be able to get on there quite squarely, but if you have a different Torx, that might work a little bit better, or you can, of course, use an Allen key in there as well. Get this nice and tight. At this point, all we need to do is adjust our Draglink for length. And what this is going to affect is the relationship between the tires and the steering wheel. So when you get this on the ground, you want to make sure the tires are facing exactly forward. Have someone looking at the steering wheel, and as you turn the attenuator, the center section here, changing the length of the Draglink, it's going to turn the steering wheel inside the vehicle. So you want the tires to be straight and you want the steering wheel to be straight. At that point, you can tighten down the adjusters take it around the block and you might need to do a little bit of fine tuning to make sure everything is nice and straight. So we have all of our adjustments done. We use a couple of wrenches on here and get these tightened. Now, what's important to note about this is if your steering wheel is off center, the Jeep can go into limp mode and or cause an issue with your stability control. So when you do take your test drive to make sure that your steering wheel is straight, make sure it's just a short drive just in case you have any issues. So that's gonna do it for the installation of our new Draglink. If you are looking for a very strong Draglink that's gonna also offer a lot more features than the factory one, I would recommend this option from Steer Smarts, and you can find it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.